In a time where a lot was happening, world wars, flappers, and stock market crashes, one piece of history is often overlooked. However, the Scopes monkey trial is one of the most interesting pieces of modern history. After Tennessee ratified the Butler Act in 1925, prohibiting the teaching of evolution in classrooms, the ACLU pressured teachers to push against the law. John Scopes, a biology substitute that stepped up, went to court in a case dubbed the Scopes monkey trial. The trial pitted defense attorney Clarence Darrow against famed William Jennings Bryan and sparked the debate on how much religion should be involved with public education. He lost the case after a 12-day trial, but it shifted views on the inclusion of religion in government and public education, causing the repeal of the Butler Act 42 years later.
The 1920s were a time to be alive. People were living comfortably, electric appliances were being invented left and right, and this was all on top of a social revolution. With this revolution came a societal battle between young, boisterous rebels and the older, traditional-minded Americans about how humans came to be. This young group had more modern ideals, including one controversial point: Darwin's theory of evolution. This novel idea stated that animals evolved over time, and that the evolutions that benefited the species would proliferate as more could reproduce to spread it. This seems like a relatively simple concept, but it contrasted the ideas of the older group. These people, known as fundamentalists, believed that man was put on Earth by God, not evolved from primates. They believed in a direct and literal interpretation of the Bible. In March of 1925, Tennessee passed a very fundamentalist law known as the Butler Act. Named after John Washington Butler, this act prohibited teaching anything that contradicted the fundamentalist viewpoint of God's creation.
This is where a group known as the ACLU comes into play. The ACLU, or American Civil Liberties Union, is an organization known for protecting the constitutional rights of Americans. This was their first major case, but the union has gone on to work in many cases since that have helped benefit American lives. Their major role in the Scopes trial was to pressure high school teachers into pushing back against the Butler Act. Their main goal was to get a court trial and bring attention to the matter in an official case. In a court setting, this pitted fundamentalism directly against evolution. Most teachers refused. A case could be bad for their reputation, and for most, it didn't really matter. However, one teacher by the name of John Scopes stepped up against fundamentalism at a time when it held all the power in the world. John Scopes was a 24-year-old physics and math teacher. When approached by the ACLU, he was the one to say yes, though not for the obvious reasons. Scopes wasn't an avid modernist. He was relatively indifferent to the entire debate. Instead, he fought for a better cause: academic freedom. He wasn't content allowing the government to prevent teaching such a hotly debated topic. The trial, to him, was more about sending a message. Additionally, he was studying law himself and didn't care too much about the reputation this trial would give him. His lawyer was famed attorney Clarence Darrow. Darrow began his career as an attorney for the Northwestern Railway. He went on to become a well-known labor attorney, defending famous names such as Eugene Debs and making a national name for himself. Overall, he was a primary figure in many labor and political court cases. The Scopes trial was different. Darrow agreed to be Scopes' lawyer for one reason: William Jennings Bryan was going to be at the trial. Darrow had been trying to have a debate on fundamentalism with Bryan for years, and this was his perfect opportunity. If you don't recognize that name immediately, William Jennings Bryan is one of the most prominent figures in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was a 3-time Democratic nominee for president and a prominent figure in religious debates.
This is where Darrow's brilliance as a lawyer comes into play. He came up with a counterargument. The Bible's words were not meant to be taken literally. It was this point that would be argued in court. By making this the argument, Darrow allowed the debate on fundamentalism, which considered the Bible to be completely literal, to enter the courtroom. Another way they found to protest examples of forced religion was in the opening prayer of the courts. For multiple days, various people would be brought in to object. This includes Darrow himself, Unitarians, Jews, and more. Keep in mind, the crowd in the courtroom was obviously and dramatically anti-evolution. A group of people, labeled the Anti-Evolution League, were stationed outside. When one potential juror mentioned that he was anti-evolution, the courtroom erupted in applause. The courtroom was constantly facing fiery speeches from both sides. Dudley Malone, a lawyer, had his duel to the death speech. In this speech, he argued that children of this generation were bright and deserved a chance to make their own opinions. He famously said, "We have just had a war with 20 million dead. Civilization is not so proud of the work of the adults." The
Passionate
rivals, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, also had spirited speeches planned. Clarence Darrow, who spoke against the primarily fundamentalist-dominated courtroom, still managed to turn the tides of the court at all times. In fact, he did it in the most dramatic way possible. When he took the stand, Darrow called William Jennings Bryan himself up as an expert witness. Darrow cleverly chose his words to humiliate Bryan, even flustering him to the point where he would spew words trying to right himself. Darrow pushed Bryan to the point of saying, "I do not think about the things I don't think about." Despite this embarrassment, Darrow and Scopes still lost the case. Scopes was initially fined $100, though later on it would be removed on a technicality. Despite this loss, the ACLU was very happy. In fact, in Darrow's closing statement, he said, "We cannot explain to you that we think you should return a verdict of not guilty. We do not ask it." This shows how the ACLU's goal wasn't to win the court case. Rather, it was to bring the issue to a national scale, and that they did very well.
The end of the trial wasn't the end of the debate. In fact, this debate is still going on today. Every year, millions of kids are taught evolution. However, many are still taught creationism in private schools. The trial arguably went against academic freedom, as many textbook companies stopped supporting evolution due to the trial's guilty verdict. However, the Scopes trial was not all for none. Though Scopes lost in the short term, his long-term effect far outweighs those issues. First off, the trial sparked a national debate that brought attention to the situation. The Butler Act was not repealed for over 40 years, but as of May 18, 1967, it was removed from Tennessee law. The Scopes trial had a significant effect on education as we know it today. It made it clear that there was no law that could restrict education without backlash. Even though Scopes lost the trial, he essentially won, as the Butler Act was never enforced again after the trial, serving as a victory for the ACLU and Scopes himself. This trial wasn't just a battle between a high school teacher and Tennessee legislation. It was more than that. It was about the battle between academic freedom and the influence of religion in government affairs. Even though the Bill of Rights clearly states that the government shall not establish a religion, Tennessee essentially did so with the Butler Act. It made it so the ideals of fundamentalism were seen to rather than the freedom to choose religious education. While this sounds like it would be a hotly protested piece of legislation, it wasn't. This is because the debate was mainly one-sided in favor of the act, and it didn't draw much attention.
It also set a precedent for modern-day views on education laws. Ironically, the precedent is for the loser's side. One example of this is the 2012 Tennessee Academic Freedom Bill, dubbed the Monkey Bill after its relation to the trial. It does the opposite of what the Butler Act did. Instead of fining teachers for controversial topics, it protects teachers that allow students to discuss contentious topics, like evolution and climate change. To sum it all up, after the ratification of Tennessee's Butler Act in 1925, the ACLU looked to teachers to fight back and get a case. The biology substitute John Scopes agreed and went to court in his famous Scopes Monkey trial. The trial included a debate between lawyer Clarence Darrow and politician William Jennings Bryan, and sparked the debate on how much religion should be involved in public education. Scopes lost after a 12-day trial, but it shifted views on the inclusion of religion in government and public education, causing the Butler Act to never be enforced again and eventually be repealed 42 years later.